Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to finish the Chigorin series with the main line, and we're going to be looking at the move knight c3 for white, which is incredibly dangerous for both sides. And basically by playing the Chigorin, black is risking getting into this position in which his main idea is quick development, rapid development, attacking play, aggressive placement of the pieces, pins all over the board, and hoping that white goes wrong. Now, it's highly likely that white is going to go wrong. However, if he doesn't, black's play is not at all justified, and black is going to have a hard time navigating the positions. That being said, it's much easier for white to blunder in practical play, so the scores sort of even out even on the highest levels. And the engine of course prefers white with correct play, but nevertheless it's a solid opening for black. So we're looking at the main line knight c3. The idea behind knight c3 is of course black is unable to support his center with the c-pawn, therefore let's attack the center, and white has of course created a threat, just knight takes pawn on d5. So black has several options. I'm going to mention a few sidelines quickly. We're going to have a look at e6, we're going to have a look at e5, the Tartakower Gambit, and we're going to have a look at knight f6, but we will focus heavily on dc4, which is the principal move. And basically by playing the Chigorin, black is trying to do two things. Firstly, put pressure on the pawn on d4, so dc makes a lot of sense, putting pressure on d4 straight away. Also trying to play the move e5, which is supported by the knight. And if we play dc4 and white simply does nothing, for example plays pawn to e4, which is a move we would like to play in normal queen's pawn openings, then of course we can just take on d4 with the queen and we are better. So by playing knight c3, white has chosen not to defend the pawn on d4, making dc a powerful threat. So white has several options after dc4, and we're going to have a look at all of them. White can play knight f3, white can play d5, or white can play e3, all doing something to defend d4. But before we get into that, let's go through the sidelines quickly. First of all, let's have a look at e6. After knight c3, e6 is the most passive move, and this basically defends the pawn on d5, keeps this bishop locked in. As we are going to see, we really want this bishop on g4, and usually in the main line Chigorin we want to have our bishop on g4, the other bishop on b4, knights on c6, f6, tremendous pressure on the center, and just trying to blast white off the board. So having said that, e6 doesn't seem like a logical move in this position. It's not a bad move, it's just not the most active. White should continue with knight f3, and now black has the option to play bishop b4, but this move bishop b4 isn't as effective in this position because there's no knight on f6, there's no pawn on e4, as we are going to see in other positions when black is threatening either knight takes e4 or knight e4. That's far more effective. So knight f6 is the better choice. And white continues bishop g5, pinning the knight. We unpin with bishop e7, white plays pawn to e3, and now what we have is a normal position except that the knight is on c6, which can be good, can be bad. I'm not a fan of blocking my c-pawn. I've been playing the semi-Slav for a long time, so I like to have my d5 pawn protected, but it's not a huge deficit. Okay, black castles. White plays rook c1, we play h6. It is possible to take on f6, but usually you can take on f6 when the bishop is either still on f8 or on b4. So in this position, bishop h4 is more logical. Now knight e4 leads to an exchange, and white should always be slightly better. Let's say knight e7, let's say bishop to d3. You can of course take on e4, but that's unnecessary. Takes. And now the knight has moved. Black has the option to support his center. He can also take on c4, and after bishop c4 continue with b6, bishop b7, c5, or even c6 and e5, and black is going to have a very hard time equalizing. So the move e6 is not something I would recommend. Now let's look at e5. e5, the Tartakower Gambit is simply not good if white knows what he is doing, so this is not popular on the highest level. There's a game, Ben Feingold actually plays this, and that's why I've spent most of my time studying this move from his games. Unfortunately, if you look at his games, he loses most of them when he plays good players. There's his game against Alexei Drev, which he lost, and there's also a game against Gabriel Sargsyan, which he lost. So the basic idea of the move e5 is I want to blast through the center straight away, regardless of what happens afterwards. And white should simply take on d5 and be better. I'm going to show you two moves that give black an advantage, so white should avoid them. The first move is d5, and this is simply better for black after d4. You now have to play something like knight d5, knight g7, threatening to win a pawn, e4 defending the knight, but now en passant, bishop takes, and knight d5, pawn d5, knight e5, and white is left with an isolated queen's pawn, which is not on d4, it's on d5. It lacks protection, and this knight is actually good. Black can, of course, also develop with tempo, but be careful about queen a4. So this is not good. Also, knight takes d5 is bad because of knight takes d4, and again, black should have a slight edge after e3 and knight e6, and for example knight f3 c6, where you get to either trade the queens or misplace the knight, so queen d1, knight d1, and bishop d6 or f6 are both good, and black should have a slight edge in this position with a small actually opening advantage because he has a lead in development. As you can see, black has two pieces developed, it's white to move, so it's as if the colors were reversed. But cd5, which is the main move, in my opinion, almost refutes the Tartakower Gambit, and black should really have nothing after cd5. So cd5, the idea is knight d4. You don't gambit a pawn, you get your pawn back, but you go for this trade, which attempts to complicate the position. However, after the move e3 and knight f5, there's really nothing in this position. Bishop d6, bishop b5 check, bishop d7, you have to trade pieces. c6 of course doesn't work, so bishop takes, queen takes, and now e4, misplacing the knight once again. The knight goes back to e7, and after white castles, you're forced to play the move h6 to prevent bishop g5. If you try to play knight f6 and castle, then bishop g5 comes, and you either have to move the knight again, which loses a pawn, for example knight h5, knight e5, or you have to give up castling rights. So after castles, you play h6, losing another move, and after something like queen b3, you have to play b6, losing another move. And white has more space, white has very active pieces. Your bishop on d6, which is the normal Chigorin bishop in these positions, doesn't really do much. You are two moves away from castling, and I understand why the engine prefers white in this position. So I know that strong players play e5. Ben Feingold is of course a very strong grandmaster, but you are risking a lot. If white knows what he is doing, you're going to be worse. Another move I would like to mention is, instead of the main line of course, is knight f6. And now this move can transpose to the main line easily. If white plays knight f3, which is the main move, you have the option to play cd5 and you are in the main line. We are going to have a look at that. However, white doesn't have to play knight f3, white can play cd5. And with this move, white is committing himself a lot, which makes knight f6 an interesting option for black on move 3. Let's look at what happens. You take on d5, and now white has two options, knight f3, which is less committal, and e4, which is very committal. e4 is the justification of this line. So e4, knight c3, bc3, the sort of Grunfeld center for white. The difference is you don't have c5, you don't have a bishop on g7, so you have to break the center with e5. And e5 makes a ton of sense because it forces white to commit further. Of course, de would be just crushing for black. Queen d1, king d1, knight e5, and black is better. So white has to play d5. And now we reroute the knight to b8, and we play a Bogo Indian idea of knight d7, knight c5. There's this great square on c5 because the pawn has moved. And I actually like this for black because it's extremely committal for white. For example, bishop e2, castles, castles, knight d7, let's say bishop e3, and knight c5, queen e7, knight c5. And you're playing a Bogo Indian with a King's Indian center, sort of, without a stupid bishop on g7. You have great control over c5. It's very hard for white to organize counterplay on the queen side, and this is a pleasant position. So, after knight d5, e4 has to be played with great care. Knight f3 is solid, more solid. Here you have a choice to play e5 or bishop g4. e5, I think, is the principled move, and after d5 you play bishop b4 and get your Chigorin play in. You have temporarily sacrificed the pawn. Well, maybe you're not even going to get it back if you choose not to, and you have great play, which is the point of this variation. Bishop d2, knight c3, bc3, bishop a5. You can see that all of your pieces are extremely active. Queen e7, bishop g2. As I said, you can take the pawn, but you don't have to. Castles, queen a4, bishop b6. Again, you can take the pawn at some point, but you don't have to. And this is pleasant. Black's pawn structure is perfect. The only thing standing in the way of complete harmony is the knight on c6, because you really would like to, well, in this position, probably have the knight on d7 and the bishop on c6, or the pawn on c6, the bishop on f5. But yeah, this is pleasant. This is pleasant for black. So knight f6 seems like a very interesting option. And of course, white can choose to play knight f3 and instead of cd5. So what do you do if knight f3? Well, as we said, you can transpose to the main line with dc, but you don't have to. If you don't want to transpose to the main line, you can play two different moves. You can play bishop g4, or you can play e6. e6 leads to the passive position after e6 on move 3, as we saw. So bishop g4 seems interesting. And now again, since you haven't taken on c4, white should really take on d5. And after knight d5, e4, we get the same Grunfeld center. And again, we get to play e5, and again d5, and again this idea. So we get a pretty similar position. So knight f6 seems very interesting. After knight f6, your idea is not to take on c4. Your idea is to have a bishop on g4 and to play an early e5 and to be able to play, if white takes on d5, which you should, to play knight d5 and then you take on c3. So this is very interesting. Okay, now let's finally head over to the main line. This is why black plays the Chigorin, and this is how black tries to punish knight c3. So this is going to be our focus for this video. So we are trying to put immediate pressure on d4. We take on c4. Fine, d takes c4. Now, what can white do? White has three options, basically. We are going to be focusing on the move knight f3, which happens pretty much every time. e3 is an option I would like to mention briefly, which is quite passive, and it should be met with e5 and d5 knight c7, where after bishop c4 and knight g6, black has absolutely no issues in this position. e4 is going to happen, but that will give up the f4 square, and you are going to play knight f6, bishop d6, and the pleasant position. So e3 is kind of passive. An interesting option, though, is the very early d5, and this we have to study somewhat if we are going to play the Chigorin, because it can be scary. Of course, you have the option to play knight e5 in this position, and since there's no pawn on d4, so you should play knight e5. And white has three different moves here. All three, I think, if black plays correctly, give black a very pleasant position. The point is, all three moves try to dislodge the knight. Queen d4 is the most straightforward way, attacking the pawn as well. f4 is the most aggressive and the most weakening, and bishop f4 is seemingly most sensible, but actually worst of all three. So let's look at f4 first. After f4, we are playing a sort of pawn attack in the Alekhine, and after knight d7 we continue e4. However, after knight b6, it's very likely that unless white commits some more, black is going to keep his extra pawn. Remember, black is a pawn up. So white has to continue playing crazy. So a4, trying to win the c4 pawn. a5, and now bishop e3. Forced to give up his bishop pair to be able to recapture his pawn. And black is happy about that. e6, bishop takes, pawn takes, bishop takes pawn, bishop b4 pins the knight, d, bishop e. You can take on e6, you can take the queen first, let's say like this. And in this position, white doesn't really have an opening advantage. It's a 3-on-2 on the queen side for black and 4-on-3 on the king side for white. It should be perfectly equal. For example, knight e2, knight f6, and already threatening to win a pawn. So I don't think black has any issues here. So the move d5 and e5 after f4 actually leads to a risky position for white, in which he has to commit and give up his bishop to win his pawn back, and he doesn't have an advantage if black knows what he's doing. Queen d4, I think, is even slightly worse. We just play knight g6 again, queen takes c4, and now we play a6. The idea of a6 is to prevent queen a4, knight b5, and all that stuff, and to play b5 and bishop b7. So queen b3. We continue knight f6, which is normal, knight f3, and now b5. And once this bishop gets to b7, this seems like a perfectly harmonious position. The only problem we have is developing this guy on f8, but eventually we are going to be able to play either e5 or e6. So for example, e4 happens, we can now play e5. And if that's taken en passant, we take with the bishop. So no problems there. Again, our bishop is going to go to d6, and we have the f4 square. It's a very nice position. So queen d4 I don't think is a good move. And also bishop f4. Again, we play knight g6, bishop g3, sort of Caro-Kann idea, and immediately e5, which is the point of this. And after e4, we again play bishop d6. He takes his pawn back fine, but again, we have this idea of a6 and b5 and bishop to b7. So after dc4, the main line, d5 is interesting, but it shouldn't lead to an advantage for white. So we really should be focusing on the move knight f3. e3, as we said, is too passive because you want to play e4, and you have to defend your pawn, so knight f3 is the only move. Okay, now black plays knight f6, and in this position, there are 4 moves we have to study. One we just have to mention briefly, and that's e3. That's really of no concern because we strike out with e5 straight away. So we are going to be looking at bishop g5, bishop g5. We are going to be looking at d5, which is very interesting. And finally, we will have a look at e4, which is the main line. Now, d5 is the old move, and d5 is the critical move. This used to be played all the time. Recently, it got a bad reputation because it's very tricky, and black can basically hold on to the pawn or force white to go into a mental position in which black is just better, practically. The reason why d5 very early on is not good is because we have knight a5. And the only way to try and punish knight a5 is queen a4. Unfortunately for white, we have this move c6, and after c6, we are defending the knight, our pawn is defended, so you just don't have anything here. We are threatening b5, of course, defending and dislodging the queen. If you trade, then, well, you just lost your entire center. So there's one way to play this position for white, which leads to crazy positions, better for black, and that's b4. Of course, we don't want to take en passant. We want to gain a tempo on the queen. So the line goes b5, and of course, this seems to be just losing the knight. In reality, it's much better for black, because after queen a5, b a5, we now play b4. And If the knight moves, for example, knight d1, then dc, and these pawns are just very strong. They are much stronger than one piece. You are only 2 pawns up for the piece, but you have a passed pawn on c4. And in combination with bishop a6 and bishop c5 and rook c8 and castles short and rook d8 or rook b8, rook c8, it's going to be very hard to stop those pawns. So after b4, most people actually play dc6, which allows you to play bc3, and I mean, black's fine here. All of these are weak, and it's going to take both sides time to recapture those pawns, and it should be slightly better for black. So the early d5 is really no good. And after knight a5, if you want to play something else, if you want to play e4, for example, then we just continue c6, and again, a pleasant position, striking at the center. You, of course, don't have e5. So bishop g5, for example, and black basically holds on to the pawn. You can now play cd5, and after ed5, you can now play e6. You still have your extra pawn. So, for example, bishop f6, gf6. If white, for example, takes on c4, then knight c4 and queen a4 check, and bishop d7, queen takes c4. Black has given the pawn back, but he has the bishop pair, and he has the rook on c8, and he has a lot of attacking prospects. So the early d5, I really don't think is a good move. And recently, as I said, it's scored pretty bad. So yeah, let's have a look at bishop g5. After bishop g5, very early on, before e6 or e5 have been played, white is trying to disrupt black's position, and black really has nothing better but to play h6 and try to force this bishop to commit. It's possible to play bishop h4, it's possible to take. Taking, I believe, is critical. If bishop h4 is played, then you can play a6, preparing b5, and if white is not careful, you're going to keep your pawn. So d5 in this position. Now you play knight a5, e4, and in this position you can play b5, you can play c6, you can play g5. I think g5 is the best move, and after bishop g3 you simply play bishop to g7. And still, after queen a4, c6, white has to waste time and his bishop pair, regaining this pawn. So black shouldn't be in any trouble. However, this position is messy, which is why I don't really like the move don't like to face the move bishop g5. But yeah, still, it's something you have to do as black if you play this line. The other option is to take on f6, and after e takes f6, white continues e3 and picks up the pawn cleanly, bishop d6, bishop c4, and castles. And this should be a very calm position in which black has the bishop pair for not that much. Fine, white has the center, but this bishop pair is very strong, looking at the king. Okay, and now finally, let's look at the main line, and that's e4. After e4, black now has to play very actively, and this is what the Chigorin is about. We play bishop g4. Now, there's an immediate threat. You're threatening to play bishop takes f3, and knight takes d4, or queen takes d4. So white is already forced to defend. He plays bishop e3. Fine, we play e6. White gets his pawn back. Okay, material is equal. And we now play bishop b4. And again, there's a threat. Now we are threatening bishop takes c3, b takes c3, knight takes e4. So we are creating a threat after a threat after a threat. And there are two moves in this position. Queen c2, which is the old move, and queen d3, which is the modern move. Against queen d3, I'm going to show you a nice trick you can try to play, which most of the time is going to succeed, I think. So let's have a look at queen d3 first. Still, queen c2 is more popular, but queen d3 is the move on the highest levels. Fine. Here the main move is to castle, which is of course okay. And you can castle, knight d2, e5. Let me show you that. Castles, knight d2, e5, d5, knight e7. This is a normal position. And after bishop d7, White is trying to play a kingside attack, but it's going to cost him security, and yeah, castles lead to positions like this. The move I would recommend is bishop h5, and now you're setting a trap. So in this position, you are threatening bishop to g6, and if white does nothing, then you just take on c3 and play bishop g6. I'm going to show you why this works. What white should do in this position is castle, and I'm going to show you why. If white, for example, plays a3, now white is immediately losing material. So bishop c3, bc3, and bishop g6. And it seems like there are two ways to defend this pawn, either knight d2 or bishop g5. However, they both lose material. If knight d2 is played, then there's this nice trick, knight e4. And after knight e4, you play queen h4. Of course, you would like to play f3, defending your knight, but you can't because your king is still on e1. Therefore, you're going to lose this knight regardless of what you do. And black is a clean pawn up. If after bishop g6, bishop g5 is played, then you can simply play bishop e4, attacking the queen. And after, if queen e4, for example, then knight e4 just wins a pawn. So again, just a pawn up. The best move is queen e2, but now you can just play bishop d5, and again, you're a clean pawn up. So after bishop h5, white cannot play any move. White has to castle. And in this position, if you try the same thing, bishop c3, bc3, bishop g6, now knight d2 actually works, because if you play knight e4, queen h4, then f3, you just lost a piece. So against queen d3, I would recommend this move, bishop h5. Even if white does castle, you're not worse. You can just continue with castling. You can also play other normal moves, so you're not worse. And just castle. And in this position, if a3 is played, you can play bishop a5 and read out the bishop, and not all is lost. Of course, both of these moves are very committal, and white will have a hard time playing any of them. So that's queen d3. If queen c2 is played, which is the normal way to play, of course, no tricks with bishop g6 because white always has bishop d3, then we continue normally. We just castle. White plays rook d1, we play queen e7, bishop to e2 unpinning, and now e5. You have to break the center. White is always going to play d5 against e5. And in this position, we have reached the critical position of the Chigorin, in which, unless you know it, you're not going to play the correct move. It's possible to play knight b8 here and play for c5, but with the pawn still on b2, that's just not as effective. So you have to play knight d4. And we have knight d4, e d4, rook d4, and as you can see, black has now given up a pawn. However, after bishop e2, king e2, and knight g4, you should have slight compensation here for the pawn. I don't like this for black, I'll be honest, because I think white can always hold on. The main move here is knight d1, and after something like bishop c5, rook c4, knight e3, bishop e3, king e3, despite white's unsafe king, white should be okay. I don't think there's that much pressure on the position. And of course, there's pressure on c7. If you ever take on g2, there might be pressure on g7. I'll turn on the engine just to tell you the evaluation. The engine says it's plus 0.8 for white. After c6, now it says it's plus 1. So that means it's playable for black. And if this is what black gets after white's best play, then it's playable. So yeah, the mainline Chigorin is a very interesting opening. I've changed my mind several times over the course of this series as I was studying games. If I'm white, I would actually play the main line now. I wouldn't play the exchange. So yeah, I realize that I've changed my mind several times. I believe this is the critical variation for a reason. Good luck with both colors. I hope this video helps at least a bit. Let me know what you think in the comments, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.